Tonight we're here in this moment, and as we always are also in the great ongoing moment of time travel of our people, that is Torah. So we are here in this moment, and we are also inside of the book of Vayikra. Leviticus is where we find ourselves this year. And we have for centuries found ourselves here inside of Vayikra. And we are continuing on with the instructions that are focused on the priests, as this book is pretty focused on the priests. When scholars looked, biblical scholars, historical scholars came up with the idea of the hypothesis that maybe the priests were involved in the writing of this particular book. You're like, oh, you think so? What gives you that impression? Everything is focused on the priests. And this portion is focused on the priests themselves and the state they need to be in to make offerings and to create and make rituals for the people, on behalf of the people. The idea is that they need to be in a prepared state for these rituals. You do certain things like anointing, and they don't do other things, like they have a smooth shave. They can't have a smooth shave of any part of the head, so that they're prepared. And we also hear about a priest's appearance, how they look in order to perform these rituals. We also hear about the appearance of the animals that are going to be offered and their appearance. And both the priests and the animals cannot have a mum, a blemish. And this is the list that includes. Speak to Aaron and say, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a mum, a blemish, shall be qualified to offer the food of his God. No one who has a blemish shall be qualified. No one who is blind or lame or has a limb too short or too long or has a broken leg or a broken arm or a hunchback or a little person or who has a growth in their eye, who has a boil scar or a scurvy or crushed testes. None of these folks who are priests and of the priestly class, who has a mum, shall be qualified to offer the offering by fire. They shall not be qualified. They may eat of the food of the most holy as well as of the holy, but they are not qualified to enter behind the curtain or come near the altar, for they have a blemish. Those who are not visibly without blemish cannot do these holy rituals. There are passages in Torah that are so hard to read. There are many of them. Noah, where are you? I saw you were here tonight. Last week you shared such a verse with us. And this week we find these verses. They're challenging, but we don't want to avoid them or apologize around them. Instead, we want to go straight and fully into them. This is what we do. As a people, we go all the way in, especially to the places that are challenging and scary. And we name what we see. This text is Torah. And Torah is also what is written in the scroll and all the centuries and generations of how our people have spoken into the text, transforming with new realities and imaginations. This is the time travel that we are currently living in, and that our ancestors were living in 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and God willing are those who we are ancestors for. This is ongoing. And it's happening right now. It's not about how do I take this text and jam it into a box that works, but rather how does this text expand and transform us when we go right into the center of it. And the more voices and visions that get inside and look around, the better we are, the more Torah we have. Rabbi Julia Watts-Belzer, who's a rabbi and a scholar and a spiritual teacher and a longtime disability activist and LGBTQ and gender justice activist, takes this text right here, right now, transforming it and creating such beautiful Torah. She shares that her purpose is different than how it is often seen and shaped. Rather than as a scholar and a spiritual leader examining what Jewish or Christian traditions say about disability, she says, I flip the question of disability on its head. I ask how disability experience can shape our inner lives, how disability can offer insights into the texture and the tenure of spiritual life. She talks about passages in Torah like Leviticus 19, just before this, that says, do not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block in front of the blind. What an explicit and clear obligation to treat people with disabilities with decency and respect. But that's not this text. She writes about this text, I'm not interested in apologizing for this text or reconciling it with my values. Instead, I prefer to face Leviticus 21 as a powerful and disturbing text, one that makes visible the dynamics by which certain bodies are marked as inferior. I take these biblical words as a visceral reminder of the brutal power of ableism. As a historian and a scholar, she looks at the assumptions and the realities of ancient times. And there are other scholars who look right into this text and they wax poetic about the priests and their concern with symmetry and beauty. And imagine this as the desire of the divine, both in a human and in the animal that was to be offered, symmetry. This is a historical lens the scholars give us on this text, but there are also spiritual truths to be excavated. She says, I flat out don't believe these verses tell the truth of God's desire. For me, these words are a cautionary tale, a warning about how easy it is for humans to press our assumptions onto the divine. And in terms of aesthetics, she says, I have no way to know what God likes or how God sees beauty. I'm suspicious of anyone who considers that an answerable question. But as I consider the options, one interpretive choice imagines the divine as a brilliant artist, capacious creator in love with the generative possibilities of difference, and the other envisions God as a status-obsessed editor of a not especially inspired fashion magazine. Given a choice, I prefer a God who regards with pleasure and satisfaction the vast, riotous diversity of human and creature kind. Amen. So here is the text as it is here. But what about when we move through the centuries with it? What about when we move with it through the centuries, which is how we are with Torah? One of the most interesting things that I find as a rabbi is that somebody will come into my office, sit down, and say, I was just reading the Torah. Have you read this? I was just reading the Torah. I couldn't believe what was in the Torah portion. And a lot of times it's interesting because they'll say, I went to Hebrew school for many years, and I did not know what was in the Torah. And now I'm actually reading it, and woof, I have some issues. I don't know if you've heard about this before. Amen. Yes, for engaging with Torah. And also, we have been engaging in wrestling for centuries. So if we go on the journey through the centuries, what do we see? We come to the Mishnah conversations with the rabbis that went from about 70 to about 200. And here, they talk about the lifting up of hands because the priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, is a role of the priests. Now that there isn't a role of animal sacrifice, there's the role of blessing. And they say in the Mishnah, a priest who has blemishes on his hands may not lift up his hands, drawing back to this Leviticus text about the mum. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even one whose hands were colored with satis, a dye, may not lift his hands because the congregation will look at him. So now we're talking about hands, and we're talking about dye, from working with dye. We've already gone on a very big journey from what the text was to now it being about dye on somebody's hands from working. So now the concern is about being distracted by these hands. That the community will look at the hands and get distracted. That the community will be staring at the hands and not paying attention to the blessings. Staring, such a reality. Such a continuous reality for folks living with disability. Continuous staring. The other day I was signing with my sister. We were walking into Descanso Gardens, and as it always happens, it was a one-on-one conversation that had the presence of multiple other people. A continuous presence. I generally open to that as curiosity and interest, but also, for me, it's not 24/7. And there is something about the intimacy that changes when a one-on-one conversation or a one-on-three conversation or more constantly has the presence of others. I remember in the 90s a disability collection of essays called Staring Back. So here in the Mishnah, the concern is for the community to not get distracted. Remove the distracting hands so that the community doesn't get distracted. It's the go away. Go away. Go somewhere away, out of view. We have such a painful collective human history of putting those with disabilities away and out of view. And in the case for the deaf community, away and without language. Without language. You would have think that would have changed. But my sister is a teacher for deaf children, many of whom have no language at home spoken to them. They have sign language in their classroom and no language at home. Nefesh Kin Moshe Kasher, David's cousin, has written a beautiful book called Subculture Vulture, and Shavuot, he's going to be sharing about it. One of the chapters is about his mother and father, his deaf mother, and being a coda, a child of a deaf adult. And he goes into the history of sign language and notorious ones throughout history who have tried to block sign language, from the infamous Alexander Graham Bell. Let's not even get started on that guy, and if you don't know about it, you can look it up. All the way to a man in the hallway at the John Tracy Clinic who slapped my mother's hands when she tried to sign to her young daughter and said, "We don't do that here." This was a school for the deaf. You're told to be out of sight. If we move on in the centuries, we come into the Gemara. The rabbis in the Gemara spoke about what the rabbis in the Mishnah talked about. So yes, we've always done this. They talked about it, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it even more, let's talk about it even more. And we get this text in the Gemara Megillah. Rav Huna said, a priest whose eyes run with tears may not lift his hands for the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly benediction. The Gemara asked, but wasn't there a certain priest who had this condition in the neighborhood, but he would lift his hands to bless? Yes, this priest was familiar in the community. And then another one. Wasn't there another person like that in another community? Yes, but this person was familiar. And again, Rabbi Yochanan saying that a person who was blind in one eye was familiar in his town and did lift his hands. Here of the teaching of the rabbis, those with listed disabilities, with blemishes, with mum, did indeed lift their hands to bless because they were familiar. Familiar, to become familiar. That is the opposite of go away. This is to become familiar. And yet, whose responsibility is that? Whose responsibility is it to become familiar? In the text, in the Mishnah, it was about you will get distracted by their hands, so they need to not do it. Here in the Gemara, the text is, oh, that's different because we are familiar. One could read that as saying, oh, who's that on? Is that on the disabled person? No, it is not. The imperative of familiarity, as Rabbi Belzer teaches us, the ethical imperative of familiarity is on the community. That is how someone becomes familiar. It is a profound responsibility. And it's beyond just, is there a ramp? Jesus. Ramps are important, 100%. Language access is important, 100%. But we're not just talking about that. We're talking about leadership. We're talking about how we see ourselves and each other. We're talking about deep familiarity, which changes centuries of how humans have related to others with disabilities. So in this journey, we went from the text in Torah. We went from that to die on our hands to the imperative of familiarity. And thank God, Torah is ongoing because we have the profound and ongoing wisdom and possibility of what we continue to learn now. So I want to close with Rabbi Watts Belzer's speaking of her disability. Disability is an ordinary fact of life and an essential part of my being. Like most identities, it's a mixed bag, sometimes painful, sometimes frustrating, sometimes flush with exquisite, unexpected joy. If you want to know me, you've got to know my disability. This is what it is to be familiar. It's a core part of who I am, how I experience the world. I was born with cerebral palsy, and when I walked as a child, my heel used to strike ground in its own distinctive rhythm. My gait was subject to scrutiny and no small disapproval. Everyone wanted to fix it. I was a very compliant child. I tried to walk right. I stretched the thick anchor of my heel cord. I practiced over and over the motion of heel before toe. But as I did my exercise night after night, I also remembered this. I also remember listening to the offbeat of my limp, loving the sound of my own step, the way my foot struck ground, the distinctive rhythm of my walk. They were my signature, something that was purely my own. This was the first spiritual insight I traced to disability experience, the decision to cherish something about myself that other people didn't value, the decision to cherish something about myself that other people didn't value. This is our willingness to open to a Torah of transformation. May we become familiar and cherished to ourselves. May we actively answer the imperative to become cherished and familiar to each other. Shabbat Shalom.
tongue is the language of love. Forgotten tongue is the language of